Why did you and your colleagues decide that you wanted to take a look at lead exposure?
I'm interested in the effects of developmental toxicants on children, and lead is one of the most dangerous things affecting children, and also is everywhere. There's still a lot of lead paint. As we've been hearing, there's lead in old water fixtures, and there's still lead in the soil from many years of leaded gasoline. So I was very interested in quantifying the effects of the exposure that kids still have, knowing that most kids are exposed to much lower levels than we used to be concerned about. So the question was really, are the low levels that kids are being exposed to now still a cause for concern?
Tell me how you went about taking a look at that.
We used very unique data from the state of Rhode Island, where they test most children, about 80% of kids, for blood lead levels several times before they're 5 years old. So you have very good data about blood lead, and then we matched that to information from birth certificates, which gave us a lot of background information about the families, like the mother's education and where people lived at the time of the birth. And then we could also go forward and match to education records to look at kids' test scores and to information on juvenile detention to see which kids ended up in juvenile detention.
About how many children did you look at?
It was about 800,000 children.
Tell me what you found.
What we found was that even quite low levels of blood lead were still associated with significant differences in test scores. And so that's kind of the bad side. On the plus side, the gaps in exposure between the kids most likely to be exposed and the kids least likely to be exposed closed quite a bit over the sample period that we were looking at. And the policies that were aimed at mitigating lead seemed to have been pretty effective. So a lot of the reduction in blood lead levels and reductions in gaps in blood lead levels were directly due to lead mitigation policies in Rhode Island.
Did you and your fellow researchers find discrepancies or find that there were still behavioral problems and those problems with academic achievement?
One expert that I spoke to said that really you should think about it as brain damage. So if somebody has brain damage, then you can teach them to kind of work around their disability, but you can't really fix the brain damage. So that's the really tragic thing about lead, is that once a child is lead poisoned, then they have some permanent deficits. And they may show up in different ways. So again, the analogy with brain damage is useful in the sense that, if you have brain damage, then exactly how that affects you depends on what part of your brain is damaged and how damaged it is and sort of what age you were exactly when the damage occurred and so on. So similarly, kids with lead poisoning can show a wide range of deficits and may need kind of specialized care in order to realize the potential that they still have.
You had mentioned a low level in the blood still having an impact. Do you remember what that low level is?
They measure this with micrograms per deciliter of blood. And so the levels we're talking about, for the most part, it's like 2 to 3 micrograms per deciliter. A lot of people have in their mind the old thresholds for concern, which were like 10 micrograms per deciliter or 5 micrograms per deciliter. And so I think one problem with that phrasing is that, if your blood lead level is below 10 and 10 is the threshold for concern, then you assume that you shouldn't be concerned. And so what we're showing is that you should still be concerned. And to be fair, the CDC doesn't use that terminology at all anymore. They don't talk about thresholds for concern. They say that any level of detectable lead is a cause for concern, which I think is right. But I think that takes a long time to filter through to, say, the pediatric community. And there are many places where still they won't really do anything about lead unless it's over 5 at least.
Of those 800,000 children that you studied in Rhode Island, what percentage or how many of them were found with even the low levels?
So it was a significant amount.
What does that suggest to people then?
Well, just that lead still is ubiquitous. So some of the children that we studied were exposed to lead because they lived in homes that were near a highway. And even though lead gasoline was phased out in the late 90s, the soil that's near highways can still be contaminated. Similarly, in Princeton, where I live, there are areas where there's lead contamination in the soil from old pottery factories because they use lead glazes. So there's many industrial processes that use lead and places where you have lead in the soil, and you really don't know unless you test for it, even that it's there.
Do you have information on the relationship between the children who had this low-level exposure and their academic progress, and what did you find?
What we found, I think, which was the most remarkable, was that even children with these low levels, say 2 or 3 micrograms per deciliter, had significantly lower test scores than other children. They were more likely to have to repeat grades. They were more likely to have disciplinary problems in school, which was another thing that you could look at. And so it was very striking that for every microgram of lead additional, you would see a step up in the level of problems.
What kind of disciplinary problems did it seem to be?
Well, so there is an issue with looking at disciplinary problems in schools because different schools have different policies. But even within school, you could look and see that kids who had more lead in their blood were more likely to be subject to disciplinary. So this would be things like being suspended from school. Normally kids get suspended from school because they've done something that's considered to be egregious. So we didn't have exactly what they did, but we knew how they had been punished. And as I say, within school where kids are subject to the same disciplinary rules, presumably, you would still see this relationship with blood lead.
What do these findings suggest then?
These findings, I think, really affirm that we should be concerned about any level of lead in kids' blood, and that we need to develop more effective ways, both for screening. So most states have laws that say that all kids are supposed to be screened, but most states don't screen all kids. Most kids only get screened if they're already showing some kind of behavioral problem. So I think the word really has to get out to practitioners that this is something that's really important, and also even if the lead level is low, it's still really important to try and do something about it. So that's on the one side. I think the other really interesting thing about the Rhode Island example is that the successful lead remediation program that they had, focusing on landlords, was not an incredibly onerous program. So it provided incentives for landlords, it provided low interest loans, it taught people how they could remediate lead in a low cost way, and then it gave them a lead-free certificate, which was good for a number of years. So if you're a landlord and you're worried about, for example, being sued, and you took these steps, then you could protect yourself. So I think there was pretty high take-up by landlords, and it was an attractive program for them. And for me, the takeaway from that is that you just do a lot better if you can get buy-in from the owners of the properties that need to be remediated than if you go around threatening people and telling them that they have to take some really costly step to remediate, like taking away all the lead. Because then people are just not going to comply and they're not going to test, right? Because they don't want to know if it's going to cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars.
What are some parent tips? What are some of the things they can do to help protect their kids?
I think the first thing is that parents should not assume, unless they know for sure that there is no lead paint in their house, they should not assume that they're safe. And they should know that their pediatrician is supposed to test their child for lead. Really, as soon as they start crawling and putting things in their mouth, they should be tested, and then they probably should be tested again if there's any cause for concern. But they should certainly be tested at least once. And a lot of kids are not being tested. So that's the first thing. The second thing goes along with what I was just saying, is that even if you found that there was lead in your home, it doesn't have to be incredibly costly to remediate it effectively. You have to get rid of peeling paint. You have to paint over it, and that will reduce a lot of the lead from that source. The ways that kids get exposed to lead are through paint and dirt and water fixtures. And those are all things that are fairly easy to test for. So for paint, if your home was painted at any time before 1978, then it probably has lead paint in it, and so you should be really careful if there's any kind of peeling paint to remove the peeling paint and paint over it, with modern paint, which does not have lead in it. So that's really important. Also, use a certified lead contractor. You don't want somebody coming in and sanding and making lead dust all over your house either. So that's fairly easy and not that expensive to remediate. For lead in the water, it's fairly easy again to test for lead in the water, and filters work pretty well for removing lead. That's what they're doing in Newark right now, where they have an issue with lead in the water.
Commercially available?
They're commercially available filters that will filter out lead. Lead has fairly big particles, so it's easy to trap in a filter. So you can protect yourself fairly easily from lead paint and from lead in the water. Lead in the soil, I think, is a little bit trickier issue. So it could be because you're near a highway and there's lead from gasoline, which is there from the days where we had leaded gasoline. Or it could be even that you have an old house and it used to have lead paint on it and got sandblasted at a certain point or something, and all that lead ended up in the soil. So again, you can test your soil. Most states have some sort of agricultural extension service even, where you can take a sample and send it off and get it back. And depending on what you find, you should be careful about letting your kid play in the dirt, right? So if you have lead dirt, then you don't want your child playing in the mud around your house. You'd also want to be careful about growing your own vegetables. It's, a relatively simple thing you could do is make a raised bed and put clean soil in it and not grow things that are going to have deep roots. And then you could still eat your own lettuce or tomatoes and things like that.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, Janet, that you would want people to know about lead exposure?
I'm an economist, so I think about it this way. Here's the thing where the cost of prevention is fairly low, and the benefit in terms of the harms that you can prevent is really high. So I think it's, parents are asked to do so many things, but this is a really important one to think about and kind of check off your list that you're not exposing your young child in some way to lead.